I'm Ted Gideonse. I'm a teaching professor assistant teaching professor in public health. And I sort of realized that some of what I was doing is walking and talking and dealing with the fact that we really don't have very much control once we went remote. That sort of just came to my head as well. I will also point out that the design I'm using is rather ironic because we no longer use blackboards, and certainly a lot of what we're doing is no longer that live Blackboard usage where we actually write on things and go through everything that slowly. And a lot of what has happened in remote is that it's really difficult to do synchronous classes, even if we are determined to do it. So just some contextualization. I'm in public health, and I teach both the lowest division. I teach Public Health 1, which is the introductory class. I also teach the last class, which is the capstone practicum, which is also our upper division writing class. And they are very, very different. One is really about lots of information, and the other one is really about using, and it's basically, I didn't have to do too much active learning in a writing class because they're always learning actively by constantly writing and research. There's so little, there just isn't that much lecture that I could waste time on. However, obviously we had a huge thing that happened last year and over the last year. So the pandemic forced all of my classes online. I'd been doing everything in person, with online components, particularly in the practicum, because there was lots of writing, and there were lots of resources on there. Really, the class focused on teaching people how to do the assignment, so how to do the writing. It also, the enrollment in practicum didn't change that much because it's for the majors at the end, so things didn't dramatically change. It was pretty much the same. However, the intro class went from having in the summer around 50 students to having over 100. And then in the fall, we had 850 students in introductory in principles of public health. And that was hard. Even though there were, I was co-teaching and I had an army of TAs and readers, it was hard because also it was very much, we were dealing with huge pandemic issues with people all over the world. And also what we were talking about was so profoundly involved with those pandemic issues. So really a lot of it was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, what am I gonna do? These are sort of the lesser known pandemic nightmares. Like, yes, even if you're not, there's all the fear that we had about actually getting sick. But if you're working, we had all these remote classes that we had to sort of create on the fly. Lots of, not very many people knew exactly what they're doing, but also students were really isolated from each other and from us. And they were also really isolated from the world. So even if they could see everything going on, it was very difficult for a lot of them to interact with what was going on. Also, a lot of our old curriculums were just really difficult to deal with when we couldn't actually be involved as much as we want. And everyone was, as we all were, incredibly stressed out. And I think a lot of people didn't actually admit that they were as stressed out as they were. So I'll sort of try to integrate all these things. So everyone was stuck inside was the first thing that I really had to deal with this summer, which was how do you get students to engage with the public during a health emergency when they can't go outside? So in principles of public health, one of the first things that I always did, and I usually only taught it in the summer, so the classes were small and I got to be in the wonderful learning pavilion where there was lots of space, people would sit around tables, and I had them do a scavenger hunt for examples of public health in the wild. So I put them in little groups and they would go out basically and wander around campus and take pictures of things that were public health oriented, which was, as it turns out, absolutely everything. So everything from a stop sign to any signs, but things like the fact that we have sidewalks is a public health thing. So they went out, they did things, it was really fun, they interacted with each other. So I started originally during summer sessions a group project, but when we went online, we couldn't put them in groups, obviously, because they were all in different places, but we didn't want them to interact. So we had to change everything. And what we did so I basically created a photo scavenger hunt where we asked them to all put on their masks and wander outside of their neighborhoods and take pictures of public health things. So there were lots of pictures of, signs saying put on your mask, but also just the typical stuff. So with 800 students, we got lots of different things. We also wanted them to, in this first week, to also take a picture of themselves with their mask on and tell us about the mask. Where did it come from? How did it do it? So this was a way that we wanted interactions, but we also wanted to really admit where they are and what they're doing, because pretending the pandemic is not working, is not happening, is definitely not a good idea, particularly in the class. So we got them outside. We did have students that refused to go outside because it was too dangerous because of the pandemic. And then we had to explain that if you wore a mask and didn't actually interact with people, it was going to be fine. But there were a lot of people that were freaked out, but which we worked with. And it was actually really kind of fun. We also modeled it ourselves. And this is just one of the ones that found out different signs. I like the example of the falling trees, which is a classic example of public health. And that was really successful. And so we did a second one during the corner as well with a different topic. So them being isolated from each other was obviously, online communication is very, very different. So we, despite the fact that we have all these ways to talk to each other and reach each other, it is really not the same. You can't have accidental water cooler conversations online. It just doesn't really work. And I thought this wasn't going to be a huge deal. In practicum, so it's an intensive writing class on top of their 100-hour internship, which had to shift to 75 hours because of online stuff where we're like, there's not going to be enough things to do. It's going to be very, very different. The writing class it's, as we were talking about earlier, tons of scaffolding, and it's all about writing within the actual world of public health. So they're doing grants and lit reviews and policy analyses. That stuff actually worked just fine. And we didn't have to worry too much about that. It actually forced us to make the online portion of the class better. The assignments are clearer, but the practicum, the actual internship experience became really, really problematic. Not surprisingly, I mean, we had to find all these new sites instantaneously because 3/4 of them shut down. And we had to create all these new sites with a lot of people who had never done it before. So there's a lot of miscommunication and stuff like that. All the students had to figure out, the sites gave them different kinds of tasks because they couldn't do things like, coordinate a breast cancer walk or something like that. So they had to do all sorts of different things. And most of this actually worked out. We didn't have to worry too much because people needed to do stuff and they figured it out. But one thing we had to do was we changed our attendance policies dramatically. We basically went asynchronous. And I realized that because people were in all sorts of very strange situations, I couldn't get people to come to class unless I forced them in real time. So when we were doing it this way, it seemed really crazy. So what we did was we made it asynchronous, but we added 7 hours of office hours. So we basically gave them enormous amount of space to meet with us, and they've been using it constantly. The papers are better. So we basically, by not requiring attendance, we got better interactions. And we also we made huge amounts of like, yep, sure, we will totally meet with you when you do this, do that. That was amazing. But the big problem, stuff that we couldn't do, we could create all these different ways to interact with us, but they lost interactions with each other. I assumed that students would just chat, they'd be friends. However, they were not interacting with each other about the practicum. So the entire point of practicum is literally the idea that you are learning while doing. And it is very, very difficult to learn while doing if you are not talking about it. That is part of the central part of practicum experiences, that you actually have to go through the process of thinking about doing things. So that works very well when they're doing an analysis of the policy of the place, but not about professional interactions. So we had a number of really problematic things where students didn't know what to do about professional interaction problems, whether it is sexual harassment or asking for things that they were afraid, asking for help when they weren't getting it. So what we did is they had been doing journals about their practicum experience, but only for us. We would just read them and say, great, you get a little extra credit for writing everything down. What we did was we completely changed it. And this was a suggestion from a student who'd said to me, I don't talk to anyone because there's no place for us to actually congregate. We don't have a class. And I said, you know what we should do? So we created a weekly discussion forum that is asynchronous, where we broke them all into groups, and they journal about their experience and comment on each other's experience. The groups are about 15, and they are really actually talking about what they're doing. So we modeled it a bit, but they are actually talking about the process with a lot better. So I love to see this, where you see a group discussion and you see tons of numbers, like high numbers, where they're actually doing it. So this has been about creating interaction that I didn't think I needed to worry about. We're all worried about, like, no one's talking to the professors. They won't turn on their cameras. So it's like, turns out they're not talking to each other, or they're only doing it on Discord to get the answers to an exam, which is another thing entirely. So that recreation of classroom culture is the other thing that we lost. How do you recreate classroom culture of the sort of the ease of talking to students that get to know you? And a lot of it was just being really sort of admitting that the problem is happening. I discovered that if you constantly ask about how they're dealing with what's going on out there, admitting that you yourself as a person are having a lot of trouble. I asked them, they crowdsourced stress reduction, self-care, time management things. When I canceled classes because a January 6th riot basically was happening outside my apartment because I live downtown LA. I said, we have to do this. This is crazy. I hope everyone's okay. And they actually all started interacting about making sure people were actually okay. So really talking about what's going on and admitting that happened. I also gave them as many ways possible to interact with us. So whether it was private meetings, whether it was numerous office hours, it does help if you have an army of TAs like I do. And making sure that we were there to answer questions and reminding people to follow up if it's not happening. And also what I really had to do was, you have to revise things. If this is new, like a lot of it is that this didn't work, admit it's not working, and then fix it. One of the best things that has ever happened to me as a teacher was when I said I didn't know, someone asked me a question, they're like, thank you. Thank you for actually just saying you didn't know something. And I was like, that's weird. But if you actually admit that you've made a mistake and you didn't know, you actually get a lot of trust from the students. And if you're willing to change things, which we had to do multiple times, it was incredibly effective at gaining trust, but also gaining sort of better assignments. I sped through that because we were running out of time, but that is those are sort of my lessons learned over the last year of doing this.